I thought I would, I was going to use that question to tee this up for you, Tyler. Is your stance on the Old Testament and why we don't obey, certain laws? Is that why you're now okay, or why you would now say slavery's wrong? Whereas in the Old Testament, clearly God had no problem with slavery. You could have all the slaves you wanted and beat them and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, thanks for teeing that up.
Yeah.
Can I just say, go and watch my YouTube channel and listen to my podcast where I talk about it?
For those who, Tyler has addressed this quite a bit on his blog and on his channel. This is something that skeptics and critics bring up all the time. Oh, well, that Bible, your supposedly good book, it says you can have slaves and you can own people as property. And so, and there's all sorts of reasons why that is not the case. I have something specific I want to ask, but if you want to throw out a general comment on that.
Well,
about slavery.
Let me throw out a couple. Let me throw out just a couple. I'll try to keep it really, really brief because I have done probably about 8 hours of content just on this question. Two of them is that they come to the text with the assumption that when the Bible says slave, slavery, owner, whatever, it just means what we think of now when we say those terms, colored by our past of kind of antebellum, New World African slavery, right? So a lot of my work is just going through and saying those are just two separate concepts. What's happening in the Old Testament just is not that. And I argue and show that. The other thing that I try to point out is that a lot of things that happen in the law, in the same way that just because something is described in a narrative doesn't mean that it's prescribed in a narrative, right? So there people will point to passages and be like, the Bible contains rape. And they'll point to the rape of Dinah or something like that. And you're like, clearly the narrative thinks that that's wrong. It's not telling you that that's okay. Describing something is not prescription. In the law, there's something very similar. Regulating something is not endorsing something. So the same way that we're told that Moses gave us divorce because we are hard hearts and we're going to do it. And God said, okay, you're going to do it whether I tell you or not. I'm going to put massive restrictions on this thing. Is not the same thing as saying, that's great, you should do that. And the same thing happened with servitude, debt servitude, all that kind of stuff. I've given a biblical theological argument where if you actually look at not just the laws about slavery in the Old Testament, but you look at God's moral prescriptions around debt, our obligations towards debt, other responsibilities towards keeping people from being poor, which was the main thing, about loving foreigners, giving justice to foreigners, all that kind of stuff. If you actually read, in a kind of biblical theological development sense, you actually see that there is a subversive nature to that type of moral theme that's undergirding the law, that you go to the point where you get to the New Testament and Paul can say to, from Philemon and Onesimus, maybe it's the case that this all happened and your slave took a bunch of money and ran away so that you can welcome him back as a brother. And at the end of the day, if an owner looks at his former slave, and in that context, Roman slavery was much more like American slavery, antebellum, that's your brother. It's really hard to ethically maintain that any type of slavery is what we ought to be doing, even if there were regulations prior that controlled it. So that's my brief as I can get answer on that.
There were a couple of verses that I was arguing this issue, and I actually sourced some of your stuff, and there were two things that just jumped out at me where I'm like, this right here just wipes slavery, as skeptics define it, off the table. It says two verses. One in Exodus 21:16, kidnapping and selling someone, whether you're the kidnapper or the person found in possession, is a capital offense. You are put to death, right? And so you can't have slavery if you can't have kidnapping. But then secondly, in Deuteronomy 23:15 and 16, it says, if a servant runs away from their master and comes to your town, don't return him to their master. Okay, if kidnapping is a capital punishment and servants can't be forced to return to their master, in what possible sense could we be talking about slavery as the American mindset thinks of it?
Yeah.
It's just literally.
Yeah, and I mean, further than that, if you read Deuteronomy 15, you remember, I mean, 95% of servitude in the Old Testament in Israel was debt-based, right? God said, he not only set up a bunch of means so that no one would be in debt, right? If they follow the law, no one really should have been in debt. But he flat out told them, my desire is that nobody is in debt. That's what I want for you all. Follow the law, no one should be in debt. He did massive debt forgiveness. You actually require, it's always funny, again, going back to kind of the American church, and they're like, oh, we shouldn't do socialism. If you read the Old Testament law, like, you were mandated to give a portion of your own property to other people. It was required.
I know.
I know. I'm just saying. So you have all of these things going into place, but you also have Job saying about his servant. Job flat out says, look, if I have not given justice to my servant, if I have not treated them equitably, God is going to stand on their side against me. The servant, God will judge me for acting harshly against them if I have perverted justice in any way against them. They have the same creator as I do. I cannot pervert justice. This is also when you get into passages like, well, you can beat a slave whenever you want. No, you can't. You're just not reading the passage. You're reading one verse. You're ignoring that it's actually in a capital offense and saying that the only thing that happens is they can't seek retributive justice against you, right? So if you don't kill them, the punishment can't be capital because you're dealing with capital crimes. It goes on 2 verses later to apply the lex talionis to it, which is eye for eye, tooth for tooth, wound for wound, burn for burn. And if the lex talionis applies, you're required to let the servant go free, which in that case means massive debt cancellation, payment of goods, payment for loss of time, and letting them go. So you lose all the labor. You're massively penalized if you harm your servant. And if you were a harsh master and you were getting away with it, they could run away. They weren't in shackles or anything back then. They could run away, go to these safe, the cities of refuge, and be protected there. Anyone who says that the Bible endorses, slavery, and they're just not reading well at all. And this includes, Christians endorse slavery. This includes them. They got it wrong. I have no problem saying prior Christians I have no problem saying current Christians read passages wrong. I have no problem saying I'm sure I read lots of passages wrong. But in this case, I just think the people who used it to endorse slavery just got it wrong.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Patrick, were you?
I was just going to say, I always like to throw in too, when they bring up slavery, do they ever bring up the year of Jubilee? Because that was to set all people free. And so, there's a reason that God set that in.
Yeah. And
I always like to look at the example of Jacob. For 14 years, essentially, he was a slave to get his wife. That was the culture. It's nothing like going to another land, raping it of their people, bringing them back in shackles, keeping them indentured servants for life, whipping them and doing as you please, and looking at them as property and not giving them humanity. That's not even what's described. I know we're running out of time. The same is said about marriage. It's like you're not reading the Old Testament right. Just because people had many wives doesn't mean that was God's plan or God ordained that.
Yeah.
But that's a different topic. So
I think what's interesting too, I know we're running out of time, but you've hit it. Mark knew what he was lingering in front of me, is that when you read through the prophets, yes, the prophets are condemning Israel and saying you're going to go into exile because you're worshiping false gods. One of those false gods was mammon. One of those false gods was money. And over and over and over again, Israel was condemned because they failed to keep Sabbath laws. They failed to keep the Sabbath years. Every 7 years you would forgive debt, and they failed to keep the year of Jubilee, where you'd reset button, return the property to the family that originally owned it. They failed to do those things, and it says in Amos that they set their servants free, which was good for you, which is God saying good for you to not have servants. And then it says, but then you brought them right back into captivity because you sold them into slavery for the price of a sandal. You let them go, but you didn't give them any support whatsoever. you hiked up inflation so much that they couldn't even afford sandals. So they had to instantly go back into debt for you. So you could be like, oh, well, we did free you just to re-enslave, right? It's clearly against, God's desired plan, purposes for Israel to have that, even though it was regulated. So
on my issue of slavery, we've chosen to be slaves because we're in debt. That's why they kept having to go back to slavery, because they couldn't afford a sandal. We can't afford things, so we keep getting ourselves into debt, and the rules keep changing. So we're always going to be a slave, and that's the hiccup. We may not be a slave in Israel, but we're still a slave. So choose your master. Choose God or choose the bank.